Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is Teresa at Teresa's Crafty Cabana, and today's video is inspired by PM Artist Studios. Patricia for the P, she was doing some distress inks on her jelly plate, and I thought about the fact that I never really actually tried distress ink on my plate. I've only tried the distress oxide ink. So in this video, I am going to go over how I get my ombres, and with both the inks, the distress ink and the oxide inks. I did clean my jelly plate with the baby oil, both of my plates with baby oil before I got started. And I'm using two plates just to see if the older plate or the newer plate gave out any different results. So this is my, I have these little ink pads for my distress ink. I have not inked them in a while, so they're not very juicy. So keep that in mind. So to do my ombre, I roll the brayer up about maybe a quarter of the way, then I do down a quarter of the way, and I just keep kind of rocking back and forth. So a little bit up and a little bit down, so the brayer does go over the edge of the plate. I couldn't see what the ink looked like because this plate kind of hides the color, so I'm just using a scrap piece of paper right now to see if the ombre is showing up, and it is. So if you are enjoying this content or you like these kind of videos, please like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. So now I'm going to do my first print. That's going to be using the distress inks, and for the color combo here, I'm going with the February color combo on the Makers of Mixed Media artist page. They have a chartreuse, which I'm using the Twisted Citron. They've got a turquoise, which I'm using the Peacock feathers. And then I didn't have a terracotta brown, so I'm just using the spiced marmalade. And I'm just gonna brayer those again just to make my ombre. And then I go up, and then I brayer down, and I don't let the inks touch when I'm putting them on the plate. I put them next to each other but not touching, because this is the point where they're going to blend together. Also, it's important to brayer it several times to really get that color blended on the plate. For this print, I'm using sticker paper. It's just a shipping label that is a full size 8.5 by 11 sheet, and I cut it in half. This sticker paper is equivalent to copy paper. It's very thin. And this is what my distress ink, so my distress ink ombre. Now I do have a little bit of leftover ink on my roller, my brayer, so I am going to put a little bit more ink down without re-inking my gel plate. I'm even rolling some of it off over here. But what I wanted to do was capture a little bit of detail, so I'm using this mesh just to catch a little bit of texture in this next print. Well, the next pull of this same print. This is just to demonstrate how the inks layered up become darker. So if you have a really light version of the ink and you want it to be darker, you can just layer them up. So you can see it's a second generation of the ink on top, but it still shows over what I had done underneath it. So next we're going to test out the Distress Oxide ink. I'm not using the exact same colors. On this example, I'm just using the Uncharted Mariner on the bottom there. This is the Antique Linen in the middle, which is kind of like an off-white color. And then I'll use the Rusty Hinge on the top. This is more like an orange color. And then again, you can see these colors better on this plate. So I'm brayering up about a quarter of the way, even up to about a half of the way, and then I'm brayering down about a quarter of the way, and then I just keep going back and forth, a little bit up and a little bit down, just making sure to blend out where those colors touch. It is fairly easy to overdo it at this point, so if you don't want your colors over blended, don't go up into the middle of the gel plate with your brayering as much. So this is the other side of that sticker paper, so that we could get a clear comparison of what Distress inks. Mind you, they are dried out Distress inks versus Oxide inks, and Oxide inks are very juicy. Even I've had some of these inks for a long time, and they have a lot of ink on them as compared to my Distress ink. So this is leftover paint on my brayer. Without re-inking, I was able to go back in and brayer more color onto the plate. And I'm going to use that texture just like I did on the first one. And there you can see the detail of the little mesh on this one, and there's the difference on the Distress ink, the drier inks. If you have more wet inks or re-inked your ink pads, I'm not sure how much of a difference that would make. It would probably make different prints. So just keep that in mind if yours aren't turning out like mine. It could be the amount of ink left in your ink pads. For this next part, I want to use just one color and just kind of blend out my black soot, and this is my Distress ink black soot. Any of the Distress ink that's in the bigger size pads are going to hold their ink longer or seem more juicy than the little ink pads. I'm just using this embossed piece of cardstock. Just says happy birthday with a swan and some flowers, and I'm just going to set that right in the middle. And then I'm going to pull away some of that extra black around the edges just with some of my paper here. Just my brayer off roller paper. While that's still wet, because this ink doesn't dry on the plate, I'm just going to go ahead and layer this on top of the first Distress ink ombre that I made with the sticker paper. And I'm doing all of this real time so that you can get an idea of what pace to pull these prints at. So I think that looks really nice with the Distress ink. You can see the details pretty well. You can still see that ombre in the background as well. Now I'm going to test this with the Distress Oxide black soot on my other plate. You can see again, that one's so much juicier, so it leaves these almost like bubbles behind. So if you find your prints are too wet looking or bubbly looking, I'll go into in the next few to show you what you can do to get a different look than what that's giving. Gonna use the same technique here. This is my Oxide ombre on the sticker paper. And then if you put them next to each other, you can definitely see the difference. The one on the left, the Oxide, has more of like a vintagey vibe, and then the one on the right has a more crisp or clean image than the Oxide one. So I guess it really just depends on what look you're going for, because you can get two totally different looks by using these two different types of inks. Next, P from PM Artist Studios, on one of her prints, she was mentioning using gesso, so it just made me wonder if I used gesso on my paper first, and I wanted to apply the gesso with my brayer on my gel plate, but I wanted to know if that would affect my ink pulls for the distress ink, both the ink and the Oxide ink. So I'm going to make a couple of those backgrounds just using this gesso. And it's a white gesso, but it kind of looks dirty because I forgot to clean my brayer from the Distress Oxide Black Soot. That's the tricky part about working with inks, is because they don't dry, you do risk contaminating anything else you used your brayer with, whereas with the paints, the acrylic paints, you can let the paint dry on your brayer and just keep using it and it doesn't contaminate. So you can see how much of that black soot was mixed into this gesso. This is a little too dark for what I was wanting, so I just did the same thing again on the same plate with the brayer, which had gesso on it now, and I got a cleaner print this time. And I'm just using the other side of that same piece of paper. So that'll be one of my prints with the ink or the Oxide. I'm not going to use the back, just this front side. And then I'm just going to do the same thing on this other plate. I'm also curious with the gesso if the old plate has any difference from the new plate. I think this looks pretty much the same as the other one. So it's got a little bit of the black in there mixed in, but it's a very light black amount, so it looks like a gray. So now I'm going to use some color for this one, and I'm using my Distress inks again. I've got the Seedless Preserves, Spiced Marmalade for the orange, and then Abandoned Coral for my pinkish red color. And you can see I'm not touching those colors together. Just putting them next to each other. Well, maybe you can't see. It's hard to see on these plates. You can see on the brayer, as I'm starting to brayer out those colors, how it's picking up on those colors. So if you brayer up too high and down too low, you end up mixing the colors versus making an ombre. So you do have to be careful about that. In this particular example, I'm just going to see if I can pull any texture from this and from the plate before I pull the print. And remember, I'm going to be using the gesso covered copy paper. Oh, and I wanted to add one more texture. I'm layering up my textures here. This is like a ribbon that looks like, I don't know, a cool texture. All right, so for this first test, and again, I'll just remind you that my inks are very dry, and I don't have the re-inkers for a lot of my Oxide or my Distress inks, which is part of the reason why I don't use them as much, because they are more dried out. But I still wanted to see what kind of prints I could get with my Distress ink. So don't let this discourage you if you think that this isn't looking good. Your inks, if they have more ink in them, they may get better results than some of these that I'm showing you. So I have some leftover ink on my brayer, so I rolled that back onto my plate. And I'm just putting the same gesso background print over the top just to see if I can capture any more color. And at this point, I don't really know if the gesso is keeping the color from getting on the print or if it's just the amount of ink in my little pads. So of course I'm going to do the same for my Oxide ink. I'm going to do my ombre of the purple, the orange, and the lumberjack plaid. You can see my lumberjack plaid is my newest color of those three, and it is very juicy. I ended up going up too high, and my red mixed almost entirely with my spiced marmalade, and I ended up just mixing my colors at this point. I didn't make a very good ombre here because I just went up too high with my red, and it went into the other colors, and it was such a strong color that it didn't blend. It didn't ombre, it just blended. And you can see I'm rolling off some of that color because, again, the color was so intense. I was trying to remove some of that color to see if I could get a better impression. So I'm just putting some texture down into the Oxide, and this is the cleaner side of the gesso print. The color on this one definitely showed better than the color on the Distress ink over gesso. And again, I'm just showing you what my experiment is showing here. I didn't have very good results going over gesso. In general, I don't think that gesso and Oxide or Distress inks work well together because the gesso works as a resist, and oxides need something to absorb into, and so do the inks. They need paper or something that it can absorb the ink into versus roll off of or sit on top of. And also because gesso is more like a top coat, it's more likely to smear than dry. So just some things to think about if you're using a gesso tag or background piece versus just paper. So for this next one, I did more of like a brown ombre with my oxides. And I'm using copy paper again here. So for this part of my experimenting, I wanted to see if I pulled an ombre of my oxides and an ombre of my Distress inks, and then pulled a second layer after. I'm going to increase the color by using the same brayer over again without re-inking. I'm just going to layer up this to get a more intense color of this ombre. But then I'm going to layer the Distress ink with a design on top of this one, and then I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to make a Distress ink background and layer Distress Oxide ink on top of that. And I just want to see if that would make any kind of a difference. So again, you can see it's a little bubbly with the Oxide inks being more of a wet ink. Then I've got my 3 colors of Distress ink. I'm going to use this Hickory Smoke, some Wild Honey, and some Vintage Photo. You can see the brown and the Wild Honey on this one. The gray is in the middle. This is kind of how you can tell by just looking at your brayer, if you can see through your brayer color. If it's black, you probably wouldn't be able to see it, but since I had white on the background, I can see that my brayer looks ombreed, so my print should be ombreed. And just so that I get a similar test as my Distress Oxides, I'm going to use a second coat without re-inking. Just going back and forth to cover the entire plate with a little more color, and then I'm just going to pull a second layer. And now my experiment part is going to be, you can see the difference. The Distress ink is a little bit cleaner. The Oxide ink is a little more bubbly and not as clean. So for layering, now I'm going to take my Distress ink, put it back onto my plate in the same order that I had it before. Brayer that out. And I just have an embossed piece of cardstock here. It's kind of like a fleur-de-lis design. Here's my Oxide background that I'm pulling my Distress ink on top of. So remember, the background, the Oxide, was bubbly, and that still shows through. So something to keep in mind here is Distress ink is definitely a more transparent ink. It is a dye ink like you would use for stamping, and it reacts with water. Whereas an Oxide is a combination of ink and pigment, and when it's sprayed or mixed with water, the ink looks oxidized. It has like almost like a creamy white, milky white color to it, versus the ink color, which stays true to its color. It can just be watered down. So they're totally different inks in that case. So this experiment was just seeing which would do better, or maybe they're not considered better, but what is the difference between using the two inks, and when would you want to use one versus the other? Or maybe you don't like the look of them at all. They're a lot more tricky than using the acrylic paints. So I did pull a second layer over that first one. I did a second design of the Distress ink because the first design was so light I could hardly see it. So I did it again, and it was a little bit darker that time. Now I'm putting my Distress Oxide inks on my plate, and after I pull or brayer this one out, I'm going to use a different texture for this one. This is another embossing folder that I have. It's just alphabets, just in different wonky ways that they're laid out. And I used my Distress ink background. So the smoother blend is the Distress ink in the background, and the Oxide on top, it still did bubble up, but it looks smoother to me using Oxide over ink than ink over Oxide. And I think part of it has to do with the ink being a more transparent ink than the oxides. Didn't layer over oxide very well, whereas oxide layered over distress ink very well. So I did not clean off my brayer or my gel plates, and I'm just applying another coat of this ink that's left over. This is my oxide ink, and this time I'm using cardstock. So this is 140-pound cardstock. Just putting a little butterfly on here so I can get a little bit of a design. I think that paper has a big impact on what a distress ink or oxide ink background is going to look like. So remember, this is second generation oxide ink, meaning that it's just the leftover ink on my brayer. And then I have that butterfly design left on my plate. So I'm just gonna pull that design right over that same butterfly shape. I didn't realize I offset it a little, but it makes it look like it has a shadow. So that looks really cool. Now I'm going to make an ombre with my distress inks. I am cleaning off those browns before I go over my colors over here with my ink. I'm not going to brayer off that extra color. Pulling a little bit more texture. And this is also 110-pound copy paper. It's the other side of that sheet. All it is one ombre layer of the distress ink, pulling one texture design out of it and then pulling that as a print. So you can see how much better this turned out than even when I used the gesso background. So the gesso background was so light you really couldn't even see the colors. I used those same colors and just pulled it onto the cardstock with the paper versus the gesso, and the colors pulled up really nice. So my experiment brain wanted to know if I add more ink to the plate and just layer full ink over the gesso, could I get a better coloring over that one piece that was very light? Or will the gesso just not absorb it and it just won't show? So for this layer, I did get more color showing up on my background here. And again, this is over the gesso. So the thing that I'm learning and that I'm hoping that you catch on to is distress inks are all about building up the layers. If you don't like how light one of your prints are, you can build up the layers on top of it. And also with the distress inks, they'll probably layer over each other. So if I did a pink on top of a blue, I would get a purple. Whereas with the oxides, I don't know if that would work. I didn't test that in this video. Might have to test that in another one. But it's definitely working with the two inks. They're not identical, and they definitely leave different results. Although in some cases they look similar to me, other cases they just don't react at all the same. So I'm ombreing out some Distress Oxide again on this plate with the Seedless Preserves in the middle this time. And I am rolling off some of that color because again, the oxides are so juicy. I'm wanting to make the ink bubbles smaller on the plate, making them look more blended. So the benefit to using the Oxide ink is because the ink stays on that brayer, you can get 2 to 3 prints without having to re-ink your plate. But the problem with that is they're not always going to be each impression that you do is going to be lighter and lighter. So if you just layer it over the same page, you're just going to get a darker and darker ombre of that same color. But you have to be careful because you have to get your ombre to be the same. But it's all experimenting here. So this is what the Oxide blended out, and then a little texture on it on my cardstock looks like. So I've got, these are my 2 inks over the inks, and then my just Oxide on its own. So I'll go over my comparison of each. The gesso, I would say, was a flop for me. I didn't enjoy using the gesso, not with the Distress inks. So these were my 2 gesso backgrounds, and the first one was with the ink, the second one was with the Oxide. Then this is Oxide on cardstock, just on its own, 1 layer with a texture into it, and it makes it look like almost like pop art, like speckly. So vintage, speckled, it has its purpose and it looks cool kind of by itself. So this is Distress Oxide over Distress ink on copy paper. And then I have these 2 Distress inks. So let's go over this one first. This is Distress ink with a texture on the 140-pound cardstock. Just 1 layer of ink, but look at how much color that one shows. And then this one is the Distress Oxide background with Distress ink layered on top. It was very difficult to see the ink on the top versus the Oxide on top of the ink looks much more clear. Then for our next set, we've got the Distress ink all the way on the right and Distress Oxide all the way on the left. Now for the ink, you can see the image, the dots are finer dots, even though you can still see there's little dots. And with the Oxide, the dots are bigger dots. Then this butterfly print, that was a 2nd generation of Distress Oxide on a piece of 140-pound cardstock. Totally different in as far as how much more it blended out using the second layer of ink versus the first layer of ink. So I hope this helped you understand the difference between the Distress ink and the Oxide inks on the gel plate, and I hope it encourages you to get inky and try out different inks on your gel plate and just see how they work. So stick with me for the next one, and I will be sharing a review about PM Artist Studios. They sent me a package, and I'll be going over what I got in that package in my next video. Thanks for being here, and happy crafting.